Elise Boulding, to our program on peace. You have been called the matriarch of the 20th century peace research movement. You were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990. You have taught in the field of sociology and women's studies at the University of Colorado and at Dartmouth College, traveled all over the world, written countless articles and several books on the subject of peace, the most recent of which is The Culture of Peace, The Hidden Side of History. Now at the age of 82, you are still an activist in organizations which you believe are moving the culture of peace forward. And we'll talk about these in a moment. But first, what does a culture of peace mean to you?
Well, a culture of peace has to do with how people interact, how they deal with difference. You know, no two human beings are alike. And so life is full of dealing with the fact that we experience differently, have different wants and needs and so on. Every human being needs to bond with other people. I mean, we need a feeling of connectedness, but we also need our own space, being who we are. And in a culture of peace, you get that balance between the bonding. It'd be awful if people did nothing but go around hugging each other all the time. So a balance between that bonding and that respecting of the other space, and finding ways to deal creatively with the difference.
There's a strong spiritual component to the practice of a culture of peace, I think. And your own experience as a Quaker is basic to your work, is it not?
I think that's true, but I think that it was, I discovered Quakerism at the point where Norway was invaded. That's a story we'll get into. Quakerism was there, and I thought this is the teachings of Quakerism, that we are to live in the life and power of that spirit which takes away the occasion of war. Means that we are responsible for living our lives in such a way that the things won't happen that generate anger and violence and so on. And that I try to remember that every day, because you know it asks a lot of one.
This goes back to your experience in World War II, then.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
It does.
And it was through your early Quaker experience in Syracuse that you met your husband, Kenneth, a renowned economist.
Yes.
You were only 21.
That's right. We met in a Quaker meeting, and we were engaged 18 days later.
Wow.
We always told our kids, do as we say, not as we did. But my life had been very much with music. I was a cellist, played the cello all through from the time I was about 12 years old, and my experience with I was thinking about this the other day, that if you play a lot in trios and quartets, you have to be very aware of each person in the ensemble, and you have to be continually relating to them as you play. And I thought, you know, there are some skills of peacemaking involved in playing in quartets and trios. I'd never thought of that before. But anyway, Kenneth here was already an internationally known economist, and it opened up a whole new intellectual world for me, a very, very exciting one.
Great. And I've heard you say that having been born in Norway and learning two languages, Norwegian and English, was a significant experience for you as a young child.
Yes. I grew up knowing there were two ways to interpret the world in which I lived, because my mother was terribly homesick for Norway. We were 3 when we came here, and she talked about it a lot, you know. And Norway, she felt Americans were rather greedy and you know, just that Norwegians were more sharing and more respectful of each other and so on. But we never spoke English at home. We always spoke Norwegian.
Oh.
And I had to do my lessons over in Norwegian after I came home from school every day, at least through elementary school, which I'm very glad for. I didn't like it at the time, but it means I can read and write Norwegian. But the fact that she saw the United States one way, and at school I learned about this wonderful land of opportunity, you know, and where everyone can make a good life. And I knew that there was a sense in which both these views were true. And so I learned that I would have to make my interpretation based on all the things I saw. And that was a kind of began very early in life. And I think being able to speak 2 languages or more, as you know, most later there came to be more languages, it means there are some things you can say in one language you can't say in another, you know. You just cannot literally translate. And so all of this has to do with really gaining a new understanding of the complexity of social interaction.
Interesting. Well, we'll be looking also at your grandfather's clipper ship and some of the islands where your ancestors originated.
Yes.
You and Kenneth were parents of 5 children, 4 sons and a daughter. And you were a homemaker for 18 years before you completed your doctorate in sociology on women in developing countries. Was that right? In 1969? And you were busy exploring your interest in peace and the role of women during these years.
Well, I felt those 18 years of being a full-time homemaker, which I look back on with great joy. They were very happy years. I'm sure there were frustrations too, but I felt from the beginning that homemaking was making peace. And I'll just tell you a little story that Kenneth was working for the economic and financial section of the old League of Nations when we married. So we were living in Princeton, New Jersey. And we were very concerned about the U.S. Entering the war and feeling that there were other ways to deal with the problems and that we should the country should play a peacemaking role rather than get in and fight the war. So we wrote a letter addressed to our fellow citizens saying, you know, let's be peacemakers, let's not go fight in this war, let us be the peacemakers. And deal with the problems, because there were many problems, obviously. Then, of course, it turned out that he had to leave the League of Nations because nobody associated with the League, just as today nobody associated with the UN, could start telling citizens of any country.
Sort of a political activity
yes,
there.
That was a political activity.
Right.
So he had to resign from the League, and we didn't know what we were going to do. And that was the time when the camps for conscientious objectors were being opened across the United States for those who were conscientious objectors and would not fight in the war, but who accepted the draft. And we traveled all around talking to them, cheering them on, wherever their camps were, firefighters. A lot of them were firefighters, and some of them were experimented on for hunger, starvation, and they did a lot, and some worked in mental hospitals. They did a lot of difficult things in those years. But in talking with the men, I came, as we traveled around the country, I came to realize how important their families had been in creating their own commitment to nonviolence and peace. And so I thought, when we have kids, I'll be helping to grow peacemakers.
Great.
And so it took 5 years before that first baby was born. It took a long time, but once I got started, I kept going. So I felt that what we were doing, our our home, one of the Quaker queries is your home a center of peace and love? Well, that's what and for all who come into it. Yeah.
Yes.
So I felt I was very actively raising peacemakers.
But this was a time when many women were expressing themselves. There was some newfound assertiveness going on, the male bashing, but you chose not to go in that direction. I think it fits in with what you just said about peacemaking, and that was not your direction at all. So I think that's an important distinction among women than your in that period. In the way
and you see, I saw, it was so clear to me, the Women's Strike for Peace, for example, which I was very active in, and I started the newsletter to connect all the women who were going out and demonstrating in their local communities. What we were showing was that we could produce a different kind of society. And so was the positive role of women, and that's been right through my life. I've seen every year there's some new things that women are good at, where they really make a difference, and that's been a lifetime of discovery. Yeah.
That's great. One of your fellow peace activists, Michael True, describes you in this way: her gift is her ability to integrate every life and scholarship. She applies her intelligence and imagination to everything within view. A feminist to the marrow of her bone, she refuses to dichotomize. She is a presence.
Well, dear Mike, but he's overdoing it.
But in 1967, you were elected International Chair of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILP, the oldest women's peace organization, which was founded in 1915. And your presence as a person who could contribute to world peace was recognized.
Well, by what I loved about WILP, you see, was that here was an international network that women could work across borders. It was wonderful working with the Sushila Nayar of India, who had been Gandhi's physician. And there were some incredible. I remember I could see one very tall, regal Norwegian and a Swedish member of parliament, and I could pick all these women from different parts of the world, and from Japan. Fujiko Isono, just an incredible woman, and the way they dealt creatively with the dreadful things that had happened
in their countries.
In their countries, and always taking the pieces and putting together a new pattern, and it was very exciting, and I just love networking. I always starting new newsletters to connect people on different topics, because that was so empowering.
But you also promoted joint exchanges between Soviet and American women during the height of the Cold War, and you were a pioneer in the peace studies movement. It was a new way to teach, really.
Yes, well, I remember it was WILP that sponsored these exchanges of Soviet and American women, and I remember that's where I met Margaret Mead. And everybody else was very intimidated by Margaret Mead. This is my homemaker days. But her mind worked just the way my husband Kenneth Boulding's mind worked. And I just felt so at home with the way she expressed things. We just got along so beautifully. And we didn't have a lot of contact over the years, but we stayed in touch. And,
that's great.
She just had, a different way of seeing things that put more dimensions into situations than most people were aware of. Yeah.
Interesting. You and Kenneth were founders of the International Peace Research Association, which was funded by UNESCO and the Geneva office of the Quakers. And you later served as Secretary General of this organization at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Tell us about your vision for this association.
Yes. Well, Kenneth really had started the first Center for Conflict Resolution in the United States.
In the United States.
And this was at the University of Michigan. Johan Galtung founded the first one in Europe, in Norway, which was immediately a connection. And they didn't have any money, and they couldn't hire staff. They just had this center, and people gave time, professors gave time. I went in as a homemaker volunteer. And so I would carry, they had the weekly seminars, I would carry a big pot of coffee from home, serve the coffee, take notes during the seminar, write up the notes, and distribute them. And it was an education for me, because these were seminars of all the people discovering the field of peace studies at our university. And then at the center, people were writing from all over the world. What's this you're doing in peace research? This is what we're doing in Australia. This is what we're doing in India. This is what we're doing in Ireland. What are you doing? And nobody had time to answer those letters. They would get tossed in the wastebasket. I pulled them out of the wastebasket and would put them together and turn them into a newsletter.
Oh, great.
And send them back out. Anybody who wrote would get back a newsletter telling what all the other people were doing. And this went on for a couple of years, and then we met in London and then in Geneva. The Geneva Friends helped. And we formed an association. But it really, I always say that the International Peace Research Association was born out of the letters I rescued from the wastebasket.
Great, that's great.
In Michigan.
Very creative. You're a strong advocate for the United Nations, and you've served as a commission member of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. What was your work with UNESCO?
Well, it was very much went to them for help with getting the Peace Research Association started, and they had a division on peace, and so I worked very closely with that, and you know, there was a whole world of development there in UNESCO that in this country we just didn't connect with, which was so sad, and so I was always trying to call attention to things that were going on at UNESCO and developing projects at UNESCO that would be in the field of peace education. I can't remember now what all the projects were, but I do remember that particularly getting women, recognizing the importance of women in peace research. So we spent a lot of time on that, had special seminars for women. But oh dear, I've lost track of what it was I wanted to.
Well, we can come back to that.
Yeah.
And you also served on the board of the UN University in Tokyo.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, you know, my connection with that goes back to I was the only person on the board who had been involved with the students back at the University of Michigan, the Americans Committed to World Responsibility, a group of students who flew to UNESCO in Paris and petitioned that there should be a UN university formed.
Oh.
And I worked very closely with them and wrote about them and networked, helped that kind of networking. And eventually the UN, but it was years later that the UN university was actually found, but they had set that process in motion, that student movement. So when they asked me to serve on the board, I was thrilled because I remembered those students. I felt it was Tom Hayden had been one of those
really?
students. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So my time on the board, I did everything I could to have a sort of a peace studies component so that any university around the world that would connect with the UN University on special projects, which they did special projects on, matters of peace and environment and development and so on, the major social issues facing the world. That there should always be a teaching component for undergraduate students, because the UN stuff was all graduate students and professors working on research projects, which were very important. But to have a teacher, I tried so hard through my entire term on the board, but I did not succeed. But what I did succeed in was to have seminars on women in universities and to help upgrade the status of women in the university scene. So we have a book that came out on that was published by UNESCO, and all these good things that came out. But it's still, the UNU still holds an enormous promise, but it has not yet become visible through actual being associated with courses on the problematique of the UN of the world. There's still a task unfinished there.
And it's still active, though.
Oh yes. I get their reports. I read their reports eagerly, and every.
Is it considered part of UNESCO?
The UNESCO, it has a special relationship with UNESCO, but it's an independent institution. That we have to develop a new conception of the UN itself. And we have to, all of our peace movements and different kinds of efforts, to make the world a better place, have to learn how to activate all the levels from the local to the global. So that the local branches like of WELP and WAND and the Fellowship of Reconciliation and many others, the local branches connect with their national branches, which connect with their international, and they have a place at the UN. Every one of the, there are 25,000, 30,000, I'm not sure now exactly how many transnational non-governmental organizations there are. It keeps exploding. When I wrote a book about it all, I said 20,000, but there are many more now. That this network covers the planet, and anywhere that you are living, you can see, work on the problems you're working on, connect your way up through regional, through your own NGO and through the regional associations like the Council of Europe, the New African Union, and so on, the European Union and the African Union, and up to the UN to activate the kind of creative problem solving that has developed at the grassroots. Drawing on the different kinds of skills that diplomats and so on, the two-track diplomacy and all, lots of terms to cover this sort of thing, so that the UN itself becomes a place where one has the same kind of primary feelings of loyalty and attachment to the UN itself, we the peoples of the United Nations. It isn't we the states, it's we the peoples. And so activating our citizenship in that, our local citizenship, and also being much more aware of the fact that those 191 states are spread across by all these transnational organizations and by the 10,000 ethnies, all these culture groups, indigenous identity groups, ethnic, racial, religious, who each have their history of how to deal with the world, how to live on the planet, and so on. And they, to interweave our work, make sure that we are always inclusive of this diversity of ethnies, because each one has special knowledge, special knowledge of how to do peacemaking. In fact, the restorative justice movement, which we didn't get around to discussing, which I'm being active in now, is drawing on the traditional tribal practices
Right.
of healing circles.
Right.
You don't just take somebody to court and say, if you did wrong, you're going to be punished, you're going to jail. You take them to a healing circle and say, you did wrong,
Mm-hmm.
how are you going to make it right, and what can we do to help you come back into be a positive functioning citizen in our society.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes out of the most ancient tribal lore
Mm-hmm.
around the
Mm-hmm.
world. Every tribal group has some kind of a practice of healing
Mm-hmm.
circles.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them work better than others, of course, but there's so much to do, and we always have to, whatever we're doing here, where you and I are, it must connect, use all those networks
Mm-hmm.
and those linkages
Mm-hmm.
so that it's for the world, the planet we love. Have a special appointee from UNESCO to work
And you
with
were
it.
appointed by President Carter to a post that led to the establishment of the United States Institute of Peace.
Mm-hmm.
Not
Yes.
many of us may know about
Yeah.
this. What is it, and
Yes,
what does it
well,
do?
I'm that was one of the things that made me very happy to be asked to serve on that commission. We held hearings around the country. The original vision had been to have an academy like the Naval Academy and the military academies that would teach the skills of nonviolence and peaceful
Peace building.
peace building and so on in situations of acute conflict. It didn't, what came out, what was politically acceptable and so forth and so on, was an institute that essentially became a research institute. USIP holds very fine seminars. Their newsletters, Peace Watch, and their publications, very high quality stuff. They have been so skillful in getting a balance between the more conservative and sort of, for many years, Cold War oriented people who felt that the USIP should keep the balance of the Cold War, and those who realized that there was a new way to break through the stalemates of the Cold War and a new way to engage people to think together and develop something something new.
New way of thinking.
A new way of thinking. And just recently, a career Army officer, a woman, made a presentation at a recent U.S. Institute of Peace seminar, when she talked about using information technology in peacekeeping missions, and how what you're doing is you're not exerting power, you're building trust. Oh, that was music to my ears. They got the message. And so this kind of work, trust building and developing new kinds of solutions without the old, power might makes right.
Right.
So I'm very, very happy about that. Something that I'd like to stick in here because it was so important in my life, and we've kind of skipped over the period that when that was important. Back when I was still in the full-time homemaker, we had four of our 5 children had been born. We spent a year in Palo Alto, the Institute for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, and the distinguished people were brought together from all different disciplines to talk about, just what the state of knowledge, and Kenneth was one of them. And so we moved out to California for a year, and I just loved, I went to all their seminars. What an education I got. Oh, such brilliant people. One of the scholars, several were from overseas, was Fred Polak from the Netherlands, and he came with a book under his arm that had just won the Council of Europe Award in Dutch. It was in Dutch. Die Toekomst is Verleden Tijd was the Dutch title. He needed a place to live, and they said, look, you've got a guest room, you've got a guest house at the back of your house, the people who had found our place. You could rent that to him. So we rented it to him, and he became part of our family that year. And I said, can I look at that book? I wonder if I could read Dutch. Because it sounded, it just won the Council of
like
Europe
Norwegian.
Award, and it was an important book, and he said it's about the future, how we think about the future and how that affects what we do. So I thought, I found I could, my Norwegian, and I knew German very well, made it not so difficult, and I thought, I'm going to really learn Dutch, and I got a pony, I read Franz Alexander's Age of Unreason, the Dutch on one page, facing page in English. By the time I finished that book, I could read Dutch.
Wow.
So I said, Fred, I would love to translate this. Fred, now I can read your book. Then I read it, and I was so excited. I want to translate this book, and this was something I could do. I had some of my kids were in school, and I had some time. His thesis was that all through history, the societies that have had positive images of the future have been empowered by their own images to bring about creative outcomes. And societies that didn't have positive images of the future crumpled in on themselves. I thought this, how we think about the future determines how we behave in the present.
Well, this is one of the things that I wanted to bring into the present, and that is that you have been working to help people, including children, image the future. And this book obviously was a stepping stone in that process, and you want to talk about the imaging.
Well, you see that that book really affected everything I did from then on, because I realized that how people saw the future, the possibilities. I remember a session in the thing that got me doing the actual imaging workshops was I was at an international gathering, I think in Sweden, where economists were talking about the arms race and how we had to stop it. And I raised my hand and put up a question to them. If we had no armies, how would the world function? What would the world be like? Well, that's for somebody else to say. We know we need to get rid of the weapons there, but they had no idea. They had nothing they could say. So I came back home to the U.S. and thought, could we just set up a workshop where people would just be told to step in their minds into the future and imagine a world without weapons? And I started doing it, and it really caught on. I started at the UN. I did it around with people at the UN, and I did it with diplomats, and then of course I did it in WILF groups, and people always responded. They always. Sometimes people were stuck. They couldn't go into the future. They were so depressed by the present. And I found that I really had to, sometimes I had to work with people. But once they got into the future and put aside all their fears and despair and so on, then it would just bring about a new way of thinking about things. And then the last step in the workshop I always made, and how did the future come about? That we imagine the future. I hadn't I chose 3 decades into the future, 30 years, because a lot can happen in 3 decades. So the time span is 3 decades into the future. It's a world that is essentially disarmed. How did it? So first you describe it. Spend a lot of time figuring out, the different ways in which it would work, because there's so many angles, social, economic, political, and so on. Then, once you've got the picture of that, then the history, what happened last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
The timeline.
So create a history. And then the last part of the workshop, okay, we have been into the future, we have seen a disarmed world, we have imagined events. What are we going to do starting now? And so everybody comes out of that workshop with some personal commitment. And I'm still doing a little of it. I don't have enough energy for really doing the full weekend workshops very much that I used to, but we still need it. If anything, we need it more now than we did when I first started doing them.
Well, I wanted to ask you, now that you're an octogenarian, do you have a few words of wisdom for the world we live in today?
Well, I think that it is so important to keep our eye on the positive things that are happening. Because I get discouraged just like everybody else, and I read the paper every morning, and it's hard. You know, there's so much bad news, but there's a lot of stuff that doesn't appear in the daily newspapers and in the mass media. And I get all these wonderful newsletters about, one of the things that's happened is, for example, that the UN Security Council passed a resolution that there should be women in every UN peacekeeping mission anywhere in the world, because there was research showing that women, they're better listeners. You know, they've had to be. They're better listeners. So they figure out what's going on.
And WILP had a part to play in that.
Yeah, WILP had a very much a part to play in that. So this, sorry, I lost it again.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I like this quote from an unknown author.
Oh, wait a minute. I remember
thought of
now.
something
Sorry.
you want to say.
Yeah. About optimism.
Yes. Yeah.
Kenneth Boulding always used to say, what exists is possible. And so knowing all these things that are going on are possible, then there can be more of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a quote from an unknown author, but it seems to resonate with your wisdom. Peace is as essential to mental health as light to human life. I like that.
I like that.
And I see you as a fairly hopeful person.
That's true. That's true. It's because I have seen in my life, I have seen so much goodness, so much human goodness, and caring and sharing under very difficult circumstances. And as I read the reports of people who are going into the areas where there's been genocide, and groups of women will sit together, and men and women, whose partners have been killing each other, and they will listen to each other and come to understand each other's worlds and say, look, we can work together. We don't have to keep on with the killing. And so it's happening every day. That happens, and we just have to help make that visible.
Your biographer, Mary Lee Morrison, states, if we slice any part of the life of Elise Boulding, we can see the whole, the themes and patterns interwoven into a rich tapestry, rounded in her constant emphasis on making connections between people, between the local and the global, and between what is now and what could be. It is a tapestry.
Yes, it's a tapestry.